In tonight's Dateline Defense, the prospects for peace in Syria. Russia's defense ministry says its first group of warplanes in Syria are headed home. This after a surprise announcement by Russian President Vladimir Putin. He will pull back most Russian forces as peace talks resume in Geneva. For analysis tonight, I'm joined by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran, PhD, and Executive Vice President of the Burke-Macgregor Group. His new book, Margin of Victory, is out this June. Thanks for being here, Colonel.
Thank you.
There are so many layers to this move by Putin. Let's start with Syria itself. Can President Bashar al-Assad stand on his own there, or do you think he is on his way out now?
Well, people have been predicting Assad's demise almost relentlessly for the last several years. It hasn't happened. I don't think he's going to fall apart now. Clearly, Putin has made it clear to Mr. Assad that he's got to stand on his own. But let's remember that Russia is only 500 miles from Syria, so if the Russians do have to ramp up their intervention there to support him, they can do that quite easily.
Meanwhile, Putin now looks like a peacemaker in this situation, diffuses tensions with Turkey. Was that part of his strategy here?
Absolutely. Putin is not interested in going to war with anyone at this point, certainly not with the Turks. And he's put the Turks in a difficult position because I think Mr. Erdogan, who's been one of the co-conspirators with ISIS to disrupt the region and throw back Shiite influence and Iranian influence in Mesopotamia, thought that they could blame the failure of talks in Syria on the Russians. Mr. Putin has robbed him of that opportunity.
Airstrikes, of course, are expensive. Russia pounded targets inside Syria for months now. Do you think that Putin's decision to draw back at this point had anything to do with the state of the Russian economy?
The Russian economy was bad when he went in. It hasn't improved very much. So I'm not sure that we should see Russia's economic weakness as necessarily the decisive factor that many in the West would like it to be. I think that the Russian airstrikes have had an enormous impact on the Sunni Islamist opposition to Mr. Assad. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I think the Russian airstrikes have accomplished the mission. Remember, the Russians have not operated under the very constraining rules of engagement that we do. They've essentially treated anyone near the enemy as potentially the enemy, with the result that their bombing strikes have been far more destructive than anything we've launched. So all in all, I think this has been a success story for Mr. Putin, both internally and externally.
Is this a success story for U.S. efforts there in that region?
Well, you know, one wishes that we would act in a similar way. We're busy trying to protect the Iranian satellite state in southern Iraq, which makes no sense to me. Why should we protect Iranian influence and power inside Iraq? Why are we so anxious to destroy Mr. Assad and replace him with a Sunni Islamist regime that is going to look a lot more like ISIS than it will like Mr. Assad's regime? So I would prefer that we do something similar to Mr. Putin and get most of our forces out of the area and stop wasting time, money, and resources there. So from that standpoint, I view his action as very intelligent. I wish we would emulate it.
The United Nations seems to be still very concerned about Russian aggression in Ukraine and the Baltic states. Do you think that we're going to see more conflict there in the months ahead?
Yes. In fact, I think that is one of the issues in the back of Mr. Putin's mind. Where are Russia's strategic interests? As far as Mr. Putin is concerned, they are preeminently in Eastern Europe. He is determined to see the regime in Kiev undermined, if not destroyed. So we will see Russian military pressure in Eastern Ukraine ramp up. The question is, what will the people in Eastern Europe, the Germans, Scandinavians and Americans do about it? That I don't know.
We were just talking about the U.S. perspective here, and American officials have applauded Putin's announcement to pull those warplanes out, but there are plenty of other players in Syria, as you were just mentioning. Iran, Hezbollah, the Kurds, ISIS, and al-Qaeda. We have these ongoing talks in Geneva. Do you think there are chances for actual peace coming out of those talks?
I think you have a shot at what I would call a temporary cessation of violence, but real peace, as we understand it, in Montgomery County, Maryland, no. We're not going to see that anytime soon. More blood is going to be spilled. There are too many groups, as you point out, with too many different interests that simply cannot be reconciled. So as a result, I think we'll see violence continue, perhaps not at previous levels, at least not initially.
Colonel Douglas Macgregor, Executive Vice President of the Burke-Macgregor Group. Thanks so much, sir.
Thank you.